Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Janae Tibshirani and today I'm joined by Max Rashbrooke for another one of our double shot interviews. Max is an author, researcher and journalist who's just published a book on how wealth shapes our lives as New Zealanders. Wealth and New Zealand is a follow-up on the groundbreaking book he published last year, The Inequality Debate. So Max, welcome.
Thank you.
You say that we can only really understand poverty by understanding affluence. How much affluence is there really in New Zealand?
Well, if you look at internationally, New Zealand is about as unequal as most other developed countries are. So our wealthiest 1%, so that's about 34,000 adults, have got nearly a fifth of all the wealth in the country. You expand that out to the wealthiest 10%, they've got over half of all the wealth in the country. And that's pretty much what you would find also in countries like Germany or Canada. So, that's a very, very significant inequality. Well, that's a huge concentration at the upper end. And what I think that tells you is that although we sometimes like to say that we're an egalitarian society, actually we really aren't.
In your book you talk about wealth. Can you just distinguish wealth from income for us? Because they're two quite different things that I guess are interlinked.
Yeah, they are distinct but interlinked. I mean, the metaphor I use in the book is of rivers and reservoirs. So the river is the flow of income. That's how much money comes in every week, every month, every year. But that then flows into a reservoir and it gets stored up. And that's wealth. So that's how much you've got stored away. It's your stocks and that kind of thing. And the reason for talking about wealth is that, over the last few years, I've spent a lot of time talking about income and the income gaps between rich and poor. And income's really important, for your quality of life day to day. But wealth is also really important in its own right because, income is what helps you get through the week. But having wealth to draw on is what gives you stability, it gives you security, it gives you the chance to ride out tough times and plan for the future. And so the fact that a small number of people have got a very large amount of the wealth and a huge number of New Zealanders, half the population have got virtually no wealth at all, makes an enormous difference to what kind of lives people can lead.
I was just, trying to think whether this is a problem or an issue which everyone around the world has always faced, right? There's wealthier people, there's poorer people, and it's just the way things are. Do you think the problem has actually become more pronounced, or we're just more aware of it? Because, as everyone will know, there is this younger generation of rich kids, I suppose, who are out there on social media, on Instagram, showing off their money. Has the problem become worse? Was it just more pronounced?
I think it's both, probably. Yeah, absolutely. People who are wealthy today, it's much more visible than it was 30, 40 years ago because of social media, because of the saturation of all kinds of media. But the inequalities are also greater than they used to be. A lot of wealth inequality comes from income, from those flows of income. And we know that share of income in New Zealand that goes to the richest 1% has increased a lot in the last 30 years. Now, not everyone has a problem with that, and you can make an argument that that's because of merit and hard work and stuff. But what we are now seeing is that generation of older people who, became much richer over the last 30 years, they are now handing that over to the next generation, to their children. And I think that's what really gets people concerned, because it's one thing if people have, worked for their income, but when they're inheriting it, that's self-evidently unfair because lots of people don't inherit anything. And I think that sense of compounding inequality going forward, which really restricts the opportunities for in the next generation, I think that's what has people worried.
But that's not new though, is it? Their parents may have inherited the family farm or whatever as well.
It's not entirely new. Yeah, I mean, there's always been inherited wealth in New Zealand. There's always been some concentration, but the point is that it is almost certainly getting worse. I mean, we know from the figures that income gaps are vastly bigger than they were 30 years ago. We don't actually have hard data that the wealth gaps are as well, because we haven't really collected that information adequately over the last 30, 40 years in a way that's comparable. But given that, you know, a lot of wealth comes out of income, and we know that income gaps have got so much wider, to be honest, it would be pretty extraordinary if wealth inequality and therefore inheritance, you know, the level of inheritance isn't greater. That would be than it was 30 years ago. That would be really surprising. So, yes, this isn't totally new, but I think it is worse than it used to be.
Sure. And to what extent do you think it is really highlighted by the housing situation? Because, you know, first home buyers, particularly in Auckland, there's pretty much no way someone on an average salary, even with a university education, can buy a house in their 20s or even early 30s without some support from their parents, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and I think housing is where you see all those factors of the last 30 years with those growing gaps. I think that's where you see it all coming together. Because, you know, it was about 20 or 30 years ago that you started to have this big shift of income, the share of income going towards the rich. And that came at about the same point that house building rates started to taper off, in part because of a really big reduction in the amount of social housing that got built. And then you've also now got the wealthier members of the older generation passing on some of that wealth to their children who are already more fortunate than others. So you've got all these things which are compounding, and they come together, and the locus of them is the housing market. And so because of all those things, you know, disproportionate income shares, inheritance, and lack of house building means that there is a very limited number of houses going, and yeah, they will inevitably go to people, increasingly people of our generation who've got parents who can help them.
Okay, well, you know, solutions to this, obviously there's no one issue, but tax is kind of an obvious one. Can you just talk to us about some of the things you're proposing in your book here in regards to changes to our tax system? Yeah,
I mean, it's important to note that, I mean, in the book I'm not proposing anything directly, you know, it's not my manifesto for change or anything. I'm just sort of surveying the options that are out there that people talk about. And I guess there's sort of, if you think about wealth inequality, there's two ends to it. You know, there's the concentration of wealth at one end, but the, you know, really significant lack of any wealth at the other end. And so if you think that wealth inequality is a problem and it causes, you know, these issues that we've been talking about, and you're looking to address it, yeah, I mean, you would find some way to, I guess, recognise the fact that if anyone's done well and if they've generated wealth, normally there's a lot of hard work and effort in it, but they've also benefited from, you know, they've driven on roads that everybody paid for, they're employing a workforce, educated at public expense, all these things. So, you know, there's an argument for putting a bit back into the common pool of resources, yeah, and that's tax. In terms of the actual specifics, well, you know, I mean, New Zealand is pretty extraordinary in the fact that we don't tax wealth really in any meaningful way, right? You know, no inheritance tax, no annual wealth tax, no tax on gifts, really no capital gains tax, except for the very limited one that the government's just introduced. So there's all sorts of options there. You know, you could tax land, you could tax wealth, you could have a comprehensive capital gains tax, you could tax the recipients of inheritances. But whatever you did, logically you would then try to find a way of channeling that to the people at the lower end of the scale who don't have any assets. And typically the options for that are either you sort of make a grant of, you know, a cash grant to everyone when they hit adulthood. You know, so when you hit 21 you get 10,000 or whatever. Or you create some kind of matched savings scheme, you know, so that if people put into a savings fund for their kid, the government matches it, that accumulates, and then they hit adulthood. You know, again, with sort of with a wealth base behind them that will allow them to ride out the tough times that, you know, they can use to invest in housing or a business or save for their future, whatever. So you've got to, if you're thinking about the policies, you have to look at both ends, basically. Yeah,
sure. I mean, these are quite good ideas, but also will no doubt be criticised by people. It's really moving quite a bit further left than where we currently are in New Zealand. What do you think about the tall poppies argument? Do you think, you know, no doubt people will criticise you for just cutting down the tall poppies with these ideas? What's your response to that?
Yeah, I don't think it's about that at all. I mean, it comes back to that point. I mean, any wealth that's been created, no one has done it all by themselves. As an island, they've done it by drawing on the common pool of resources that society provides, the infrastructure, the health system, the education, whatever else. And if that common pool of resources is going to be there for the next generation, you have to feed back into it. Otherwise, it just gets depleted. So it's not about having a go at people at all. It's just saying, look, you need to acknowledge that this common pool of resources is really important for your success, and if people are going to succeed in future, you have to keep building that up. So it's actually a way to ensure that more people in future have the chance to achieve the kind of goals and the dreams that they have. That's the end goal, really.
Sure. Well, Max, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Thank you for your time. Appreciate that. And I'm Janae Tibshirani here at interest.co.nz.